Good morning, everybody. I'm Kim Warren. I'm the Director of Aligned Impact Muscatine. On behalf of Charlotte Schaefer from the Community Foundation, Shane Orr from United Way, Kristen Regenator from the Extension Office, and myself, welcome to the first Social Innovation Learning Lab. We do have surveys available for you to tell us what future topics you'd like us to plan for you. We'll also be sending that out more widely via email later today. Today's Social Innovation Learning Lab is putting youth on the path to college. Dave Ford will be our presenter today. He's the post-secondary readiness lead at the Mississippi Bend Area Education Agency. He'll be sharing with us what works to help students enroll in post-secondary education and how you can incorporate those activities into your youth serving program.
Thank you. This will be new for me. I'm connected to a wire. And I have a TV camera on me, so we'll see how this goes. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. I know it's a chilly morning, and most of us have had our children not in school for the better part of a couple of weeks, so being able to leave and come out and see adults has been a wonderful start to my day. So I kind of wanted to share a little bit about the work that I do at Mississippi Bend, and our agency serves 21 school districts, pretty much from Clinton County all the way, I think Columbus is probably our furthest southwest. And one of the services that we provide to schools is helping them understand what happens to their students after they graduate, where they go, and how successful are they by a variety of different measures. And then using that to come back to K-12 and say, okay, how prepared are our students really for life after high school? And what does high school provide for them? So, and their K-12 experience in general. So given that I work in education, that my background is in counseling, this is kind of counter to me on 2 weeks off, but I'm gonna start you off with a pop quiz. Because I kind of want to orient you a little bit to what some of these numbers mean. And the beginning of this will be a little bit data heavy, and then we'll get more into what does that mean for youth serving institutions and organizations, and what can they do to better help be part of this transition process for students. So I want you to think for a second, and if you serve a community agency or if you serve a specific set of schools, I want you to just think in your head the answers to these 7 questions. And it's okay if you don't necessarily know the answer, but it's also okay if you don't even know what they're asking. And we're going to break that down in just a little bit. So take a second at the screen, and I want you to try to come up with some estimates on what you think each one of those questions is, and feel free to share your responses with a neighbor. Okay, how are we feeling? 5, I could give you every one of these to the percent, and I'm real confident that I know that I'm right. 0 is I took a wild stab and I couldn't guess if you asked me to again. Where are you at? Hold them up nice and high so we can see. All right, Kim doesn't count. She's seen this a few times. So is Dr. DeWinter. She's seen this a few times, so she knows a lot of these things. You know, it's interesting when we talk with schools, you would think that these would be things that are fairly common knowledge among educators. And one of the things that we're finding is there's a big disconnect between K-12 and the higher ed world where they don't necessarily know each other's outcomes. And if we're graduating a lot of students out of our schools, and we do that very well in Iowa, I think we just had another report came out this week that we are again first in the nation in high school graduation. The assumption then is that, well, we've done a good job preparing them and they must be really successful when they leave us. So we'll come back to some of these numbers here in just a little bit. So actually, I just realized that this data is now exactly 2 days out of being up to date. So, but we still do have the highest graduation rate in the country. And Iowa has maintained that status for at least the last 8 years when the federal government really started tracking that. But probably even longer than that before that metric was widely known. But when you start looking at post-secondary attainment, which is that they've earned some kind of credential after high school, we can break that down into a lot of different categories. And the first one on there is whether or not they've gone on to earn a bachelor's degree or more. That's typically what most of us define college as. We're going to talk about that word in just a little bit as well. But one of the things that you'll notice is then our ranking in 4-year completion, 4-year degree attainment, goes from first in the nation to 35th. So that's a big drop, right? We have a lot of students who are leaving high school prepared for life after high school, including college, and a lot of our students aren't taking that step to a much greater degree than other states. And in fact, the gap between high school completers and four-year degree completers are higher. That includes master's and doctoral level folks as well, is 45th. So we have one of the biggest gaps nationally in terms of who gets a high school diploma and then who subsequently goes on and earns a four-year degree. But we know it's not just about all four-year degrees. We're also looking about what part of the population holds a two-year credential, two-year degree. And there's a little bit of a difference, make sure that we clarify. There's a difference between being complete, the percent of completion versus the percent attainment. When we're talking about attainment rates, we're talking about the population at large, not the completion rate of a specific institutions. Even on that upper one there in Iowa, our Regents universities have among the highest completion rates of four-year degree public universities in the country. When we break down two-year, this is the part that really is kind of where, and I'll talk a little bit about what Future Ready Iowa is shortly, where you notice there's a big growth area need. So we are second in the nation in two-year degree completions, and we stand at 13.2%. So we are almost a national leader in that category, and very few students are earning that credential. So we need to get more students into some more of these pipelines where they can get in and earn degree credentials there. And again, that gap though between high school completers and two and four-year completers is very, very broad. So from an economic standpoint, we have a lot of people in the workforce with a high school diploma, no additional credential, which we know is very difficult to have an economically viable life where you can pay the rent and get to and from work. I mean, basic things that we need just to kind of live on a daily basis here. So this is a chart that shows the educational attainment breakdown and income potential or income earnings. What's really interesting when you look at this, and this is a slide that if you open the newspaper, or that's a really dated way to say that. If you're flipping through your online news feed and you look at these numbers, one of the things that's really interesting is that we hear often that the more education means more money. And I want to break that myth down just a little bit, because while that's true for the averages, the upper third of people with two-year degrees are out earning the lower third of bachelor's degree earners. So in layman's terms, what that means is you're better off being a damn good welder than you are being a really crappy manager with a bachelor's degree. So it's not always just apples and apples. And also on that chart is a yellow line, and education is something that we know very, very well. Anybody want to take a guess at what you think that number is highlighting? The way that we kind of sort and filter our students in our schools. I see some people ready to say it. Go ahead and throw it out if you think you know it. What do you think that represents? That yellow arrow there, that $725. What is it? You're getting on the right track. In schools, it is a line that we sort some students above that line and some students below that line. It's free and reduced lunch. So you can look demographically at a community or a population and look at their educational attainment and tell about how many students are likely to need free and reduced lunch. Which again, I mean, those are some averages, but we know that going on after high school is really a necessity for families to be able to succeed economically. The other thing that I like to highlight on this slide is that even though you see a pretty big divide between associate's degree and bachelor's degree earners and above, part of that is also the return on investment. Students who go to a 1 or 2 year program have invested far less in terms of dollars than their 4-year counterparts. So while they do make a lot more money, student loan on average in Iowa is about $31,000 for bachelor's degree earners, which translates to about a $450 payment. I see some of this in the audience because some of you are still there with me. So when you take that out of that equation too, the dollars for dollars return on investment is much more direct. So our state about, oh boy, I want to say about 3 or 4 years ago now, has developed a college and career ready definition. Like, what did it really mean to be college and career ready for life after high school? And prior to this definition coming out, and I'll talk about each one of those 4 buckets in just a second, Our state had one way to tell kids if they were college and career ready. Anyone want to take a stab at it? ACT. So if you are over 30 and you still know and talk about your ACT score, don't raise your hand, but this is my mental message to you, like, stop doing that. It's not that valuable. But that was the way that we told students you were ready or you were not ready for college. If you were 23, you were good to go. If you were 19, sorry, too bad. And we know, and I spent most of my career before I started doing this work as both an elementary and a high school counselor. And one of the things that I knew when I worked with students was I knew students who academically were very, very well qualified, and they were wound tighter than a drum. And the first time they got a B or a C in college, the world was going to unravel for them. And I hoped somebody was there to support them when that happened. But I also knew the kid who regularly got C's and worked their butt off to get those C's. And I knew that when things didn't go well for them, when they went to higher ed, they would seek out help. They would ask their professors. They were the ones in the Career Center looking for support and options. They were kids who could self-advocate, and they had other skills that didn't line up with their ACT score. So as our state developed this new definition of college and career readiness and what that means, broke it down into 4 different buckets. And we have primarily lived within this proficiency area. Iowa assessment scores, ACT scores, GPAs, class ranks. I mean, the traditional measures that we've looked at whether or not students are ready for life after high school. But they also broke it into 3 other categories that look at transition skills, which are things like not only navigating within the education space and the career space, but just the ability to maybe be flexible and adaptable to changing work environments is another way to describe that. So can they, I mean, here's a transition skill. Can a student leave home and then independently go to college of whatever type that is? We'll come back to that word again shortly. And know that in high school, you're in school for 35 hours a week. And in college, you might only be there for 12 or 15 hours, but you still have to work that 40 hours a week. That's where that fall off comes. So they have some of those skills. Employers are saying over and over again that they need people with cognitive and learning strategies. They need to know how to collaborate. They need to know how to communicate well with others in writing and verbally. They need to be able to work as part of a team, and they need to know things like 8 to 4 means 8 to 4, not 8:13 to 3:41, like what an actual workday is. So there's some skills and some knowledge that they need to have there. And then the last one is that self-understanding and engagement, that they take pride in their work and that they know themselves well. I know I used a personal experience with this. You know, I don't know that I took a lot of time as a 17-year-old to really think about what I wanted my future to be like. But my friend's dad, and I was a kid from I was a first-generation college student in my family, and we didn't have a lot of money growing up. We lived with my grandparents as I was a kid. And one of my good friends, his father was an accountant, drove a nice fancy car, and I thought I wanted to be an accountant. And it was totally not, I was good at it because I was good at the math part of it, but it wasn't something that I really wanted to do. So I didn't necessarily translate what I was good at and what I enjoyed doing with like the world of work. You know, the idea that I didn't get to interact with other people was going to be an issue for me. So we've got a few different ways that we described that there. And as we then pull back and look at the data, this is a little bit of a confusing chart, but I want you to digest this with me together, and then I'm going to give you some time to talk to people near you. But what we see here on this chart in the blue line is our high school graduation rate, and this is for our own region. So this region I described earlier, Clinton, Jackson, Scott, and Muscatine counties, is the graduation rate over time, which has been fairly steady. If you look at those numbers even all the way back to 2011, we've really never been below almost 88%. I mean, there are entire states that would kill to have that kind of a graduation rate. But then one of the things that we also collect as a state is when students graduate, what is their intention or what's their plan after they leave? And that red line shows students who graduate high school who have said, my plan and my next stop is to go to college. College meaning 1-year, 2-year, 4-year programs, vocational and trade programs, registered apprenticeship, and or military. So those things all get looked into some version of a post-secondary training program. And you'll see there's a pretty big gap between the students who graduate and those who don't have a plan. It's almost about 17% or so statewide of the kids who graduate who then don't have an articulated plan after they leave. So their thought is, my high school diploma is going to get me where I need to be. But then we also have kids who make the plan on the red line, The next line down is, did they actually show up in their program? Did they enlist in the military? Did they actually enroll and show up at the first day of classes at MCC or University of Iowa? And you'll see there's another big drop off, right? So before we've even started the game here, we're down to almost 60% of students even starting down that trajectory. So we've lost close to half of them. The green line is persistence, meaning did they come back for a second year if they didn't complete? If they completed, we count them in that purple line. And you'll see that the majority of kids who go stay. And certainly retention is something that colleges look after very closely. But again, as a region, yes, is it concerning that we're losing 7 to 10%? Sure. But again, I think those numbers are fairly high nationally. And then the last one on there is completion. That is, again, not a completion rate, but that's an attainment. So if we look at this last little bubble right here, from an attainment standpoint, in our region, of all of the students in our area who graduated in 2011, 41.6% of them, 7 years later, have earned some kind of credential. They've completed and earned some sort of a viable credential for the workforce. So one quick little caveat here that I want to point out. This trails off not because all of a sudden things are going horribly wrong. You'll notice on the legend over here, this is more of a progression chart. They haven't been out of high school long enough to actually have earned something. So this does tell us that within 1 year of graduation, a couple of percentage of kids have earned something within a year. So, you know, you don't really see 1, 2, 3, all of a sudden you see this big jump to 4 year. So this one is more accurately representing probably a 2-year attainment rate. When I said the statewide one, I think was 13%. And this is more accurately reflecting a 4-year, which is closer to the high 30s, low 40s. So talk with your partners and remember back to what you said the answers were to those questions on our pop quiz. How'd you do? Rate yourself and talk to someone next to you. You're about 3 slides ahead of me, but that's a good question. Okay, let's bring that back up to the group here. So now that you've seen the answer key, reflect back again. How do you think you did when you guessed the first time? What jumps out at you? What is surprising to you? Good, bad, or indifferent? What observations do you make when you look at that? Completion rate? Tell me more about your thoughts. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. What else? What other things that jumped out at you? Mm-hmm. Teenagers don't do that. Sure. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's get one more observation or thought. Yeah. Than you thought. Well, we're going to talk about some disaggregated subgroup populations that don't look as high as these. So I think that that's one of the things that when your agencies are often serving students and families who are at greater risk of not being on these completion charts than others. Would we all agree with that? And here's what else is really interesting about this. I have an activity that I typically do with large groups where we talk about what's everybody in the room have, right? So generally speaking, when I talk with groups, the audience is almost always in the completion category. And in fact, they're not only in the completion category, they're typically in the bachelor's and above category. So from a family perspective, not every family has the same, I want my child to go and get a 4-year bachelor's degree or 2-year degree or something as others. I know my own family, my parents were really, really proud that I graduated and went to college. They probably could have cared less if I finished, because for them it was, he went. Well, and if I didn't make it, well, you know what, you gave it a shot, right? And we have a lot of families who don't necessarily make the direct connection between the investment of your time and money now to get a credential that pays later. I mean, that is very much a middle class ideology where you can postpone delayed gratification and you can make some sacrifices. And especially for families who are living paycheck to paycheck, that is a really difficult ask of them to expect them to do that. So, and it's difficult for us to have that conversation with them when we're kind of sitting on high and mighty telling them how it should be, when we may not have the same struggles that they may have day to day. So this is where it starts to get a little bit less optimistic. When we look at students who are on free and reduced lunch and the family population here, now look at some of the same numbers. The gaps are all the same, but all of the lines have dropped. And what's most startling is the completion rate of people. So from an income gap attainment, right? Like you've heard the wealth gap and that's just widening. That's part of the reason why, right? So if you're poor, you get poorer. And if you start off with a lot of advantages, you're going to continue to be advantaged. And then we've got, in Iowa, this is, I came here from New York and Southern California. So coming to a place that was not as diverse as where I had come from was a little bit of a culture shock. So when we look at equity gaps, particularly with race and ethnicity, the majority of Iowa high school districts have to report white and everybody who's not white together because there aren't enough students in any one subgroup to make up an N. And usually there are different definitions of either N as 10 or 30, but a lot of schools don't have enough diversity to even count them. So all of a sudden, if you look at school by school breakdown, you don't see these gaps because they can't report them legally. But when we put everybody together in a region of 35,000 students and we start highlighting some of these gaps, and these numbers are not things that you would probably be surprised to find. So again, we have completion rates for non-white students that are in the 20% area. And then last, this gets back to the question that I heard there, students with disabilities, and look where their completion rates are. So from an equity standpoint, we know that there are populations who are at greater risk of not succeeding in anything other than earning a high school credential than others. And when I typically work with groups, they say, well, this is college readiness. This is all about high school stuff. And I said, I'm going to beg to differ with you because when did you know that that kid was black? When did you know his family struggled with money? When did you know he had learning difficulties? You don't learn those things in 11th grade. We know those students, and having spent most of my career as an elementary counselor, kindergarten teachers can tell you which kids are going to make it and which kids aren't, and they're pretty damn accurate. And we have data that tells us the same thing. But we don't encourage those families to join us on that journey from age 3 or 4 or 5 of, let's talk about what's the long-term plan for your kid here. Like, how are we going to make college a possibility for them? Because if you start that conversation when they're 17, they've closed a lot of doors along the way, intentionally or unintentionally. So I think a lot of the agencies that you work with and the students and families that you serve, we're going to come back to, so what role can you play and changing some of these metrics and changing the trajectory for a lot of students. So questions about any of the data before I go on to the next one? Because I often get, where did you get this from? How did you find this out? I'm not a magician or a wizard. Students with IEPs, yep. And that they have an IEP, I believe, in the beginning of 11th grade is when that's defined. But they left. That would be for, so in the graduating class of 2011, that would be those students who still had an IEP at the beginning of grade 11. We used to measure that in grade 12, and we found that a lot of districts were exiting students from special education services in grade 12. So we were really underreporting, and the only students who were populating were the students who were really severely disabled and you couldn't exit them from services. So that's a more accurate representation now. Yes? So I'll go back to that first slide here. There are a lot of people who don't like this because it makes it look like we're doing worse. When we report out completions, typically you want to give students at least 6 years after they graduate from high school to finish whatever they started. The research on that is 150% time to degree completion. So 4-year colleges take 6 years, 2-year colleges take 3 years, which begs the question, why do they call them 2- and 4-year degrees if they take 3 and 6 years to finish? Financial aid sticks with you for 2 years, but if you take 12 credits, which is full-time a semester, for 2 years, you still have a whole year of school left to finish your program. And sometimes people forget that. But yeah, that means that they've been out of high school for at least 6 years. Yep. Any other questions on that data piece? Okay, so getting into what we found that is actually making a difference and changing these changing the trajectory for a lot of our students. We at our AEA engaged in a number of studies over the last few years. I've been there, this is my 4th year. And near the end of my first, beginning of 2nd year, we developed a research partnership with the University of Iowa, Iowa College Student Aid Commission, and our agency. And we did a study of the Gear Up program. And Gear Up is a federally funded program, and I believe it's called Gaining Early Awareness of Post-Secondary and Undergraduate Programs or something to that effect. But essentially it's a college prep type of grant to get more students, particularly those who are underrepresented in higher ed, to go. And one of the things that we did in that study was look at whether or not that program was actually working. Now, you would think that at the federal level, there has been a lot of dollars poured into Gear Up. I mean, if you get a $3,500 grant, you've got to write pages and pages of reports for that. I mean, these are multi-year. Iowa's grant, for example, was $20-something million, and we were not a big recipient nationally. Up to the point of that study, there had been no quantitative studies done to analyze the actual benefit to students who were participating in Gear Up. We were just kind of like, they're getting advising, it's probably working. So this study went through and looked at that, and this chart shows Gear Up students statewide during this period of 13, 14, 15, and 16. In the class of 2014 was our Gear Up cohort. So from our region and compared around the state, what we found was that students who participated in Gear Up had the highest high school graduation, post-secondary intent, and college enrollment that those schools had ever experienced. And it was statistically, they look like little blips on the radar up there, but from a quantitative standpoint, not only did they kind of level the playing field for students on free and reduced lunch and other at-risk categories, they actually kind of elevated above that. So there was an impact there. So what we tried to figure out was, okay, so Gear Up's great and it's working. What specifically in Gear Up was helpful to students? And we broke down, believe it or not, when they participate in Gear Up, everything a kid does gets tagged to them. If they show up at financial aid night, there's a tag. If their parents show up at financial aid, there's another tag. If the kid does an ACT prep class, so they get about, I'm going to misquote this here. There are anywhere from 50 to like 125 things that a kid can essentially get a flag for. So the smart researchers and PhDs in statistics at the University of Iowa, that was their job to flesh that out. And what we found was that college enrollment rates went up 3 to 4%. But most importantly, it cut the enrollment gap for socioeconomic status by nearly half, which is really crazy when you think about those numbers on those attainment lines and what happened to free and reduced lunch students. They were down by like 10. If we can cut enrollment by 50, that's a huge start. But more importantly, I mean, again, as a high school counselor, I could chase a kid down. I could get him to fill out a FAFSA. I could bring him to this campus and I could say, fill out your application and I'm going to be there the day that classes start at MCC. I'm going to make sure you go to classes. But the true tale of that is a year later, have they gotten through their first year successfully and did they come back? And have they become a persister? And what we found initially, we were kind of disappointed that we found that there was no impact on persistence. But when we dug a little bit deeper into the data, what we found was that meant we weren't sending underprepared kids off, because the worst category you can be in on that slide that I showed you earlier was the some college, no degree. Because what do they have that goes with that some college? They have debt, no degree. Of all categories to be in, that's the worst one. Having a $300 or $400 student loan payment and a job that can't afford to pay for that. And if you know anything about student loans, that's the one thing you really can't default on. That just stays with you forever. So I want you to reflect a little bit on this question. I'm not going to give you a ton of time on it, but I do want you to talk about, does your agency provide support to students in terms of college access? And if so, what are those services? And it's okay to say none, because we find that this has kind of been this isolated, like, well, I'm staying in my lane and that's not my lane. So talk to your neighbor about what services your agency either does or does not provide in terms of college access. I'll give you about 1 minute. Go ahead. Okay, let's bring that back up to the whole group here. So would any of you like to offer some things there, of some things that you're doing? Is your agency doing anything to support it? I see some head shaking. If you've got something, go ahead and say it out loud. Scholarships, good example of that, absolutely. Remember, college readiness is not your ACT score. My mental message to you, please stop telling people what your ACT score was if you're an adult. Okay. Awesome. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Any other examples? Okay. Yeah, so I kind of loaded this question a little bit on purpose because my guess is that all of you are providing these services and you probably aren't even aware of it or not making the connection. And here's what I mean by that. How many of you encourage families to be together? How many of you encourage students to have good communication skills with one another? How many of you encourage them to be there? If your program is an after-school program and they're not there every day, you're probably following up with them like, hey, where were you? We missed you last week. I mean, so attendance matters, and you think of all of these different things that are development of the whole child and of them as a person and helping their families develop them as whole people, that we often default to the things that sound kind of college-y, but there are a lot of other things that we're doing. And it's really important that we start making explicit connections to families that, you know, when we take them on that trip, this is why, because you may need to separate at some point in time in your child's future, and I'm really hoping that when my kids go off to whatever their life is after high school, that it doesn't look like the first day of preschool where they were like tearing at my leg and refusing to walk away. Like that was a stark, like, oh, my kids aren't as independent as I think they are. But you know, that's a tough transition for a lot of students who get homesick and don't want to stay where they are. And that doesn't even have to be geographically. Like that idea of being homesick is kind of waned in recent years because of social media and you can be connected with people at all times. You know, the old days of like saying goodbye in the driveway and coming back for break is really kind of a thing in the past for a lot of families. So the study broke down a number of things that looked at what were things that we examined, what services lead to whether or not they get into and stay in a program. So again, post-secondary, the only metrics that were not studied on this one were military because the Department of Defense is really tight about sharing their information with virtually anybody. So this is primarily apprenticeship 1 and 2 year and 4 year college programs, which is the majority in Iowa. About 1 to 3% of students statewide go into the military, do a registered apprenticeship, or go to work on the family farm. So a lot of our metrics, people will say, well, you're not including this, you're not including this. Well, even if we add all those numbers in, it really isn't representative of the population. Does it impact some students? Absolutely, but not to the degree that we often think. So these were these were 10 of the things that we studied, which services were out there, and these ones were, again, very high school specific as part of what, those fell into what was called that transition bucket of our state definition. So take a quick look at those. And think about which of those do you think has the greatest effect on whether or not kids go and stay. I'll give you a hint. You're going to see the answers to this in 2 slides. Which of those services would you have guessed have the greatest impact on whether or not a student goes or stays in post-secondary? Go ahead and talk. Someone near you. I'll give you a hint. It's some of those 10. Okay, we're going to do a little voting activity here. College visits. College visits, if you think that that's impactful, raise your hand. We got a few in the audience. Academic assistance, tutoring, a couple of those. Career and academic planning. None for that one. 4-year high school graduation plans. None for that one either. Financial aid counseling. A lot of hands on that one. Motivational speaker. Academic and career counseling, that's a little bit different than the online version. That's actually sitting down with a human and having some advising. How many of you had that one? Not very many. ACT test prep, SAT prep. Academic enhancement. And the last one is college application assistance. So as somebody who spent my career doing this, I can tell you from the as I get to the next slide, I was surprised by these results. And in fact, in Iowa, we actually have some legislation that requires schools to provide some of these things to students that the study found were not all that effective. So in terms of promoting educational excellence, college visits, meaningful college visits was one of the highest rated activities. And when we talked with students in some focus groups afterward, what we found was that they said, you know, it was the first time I actually had been on a campus. Like when people said they went away to college, I didn't know what that meant. I couldn't visualize it. So they started seeing themselves on campus. Students who took college classes in high school on a college campus felt like they were part of the college environment already. And almost all of those students actually, because of how that is structured in Iowa, if they're taking college classes in high school, most of them are taking them on a community college campus. So that, not only were they almost a 10% increase in going to college, they were even greater likely to stay. So the idea that a meaningful college visit isn't just parking and walking around campus, it's interacting with the admissions office, it's talking with advisors, it's talking with students. I was at a district before I came here, and our lowest SES elementary school, I was in a district where our district average was about 25 to 30% free and reduced lunch, and one of our elementary schools was over 50. So it was kind of like an outlier. And we started taking all of the fifth graders every year to Drake University. They did a lunch, they did all these activities. And that has been an annual activity that district has continued to bring students on. And the kids say over and over again, that was so much fun. I'd never been on a campus before. I didn't know what it was going to look like. So that was a key one. Financial aid counseling. I mean, I don't know how much more loudly that can speak. I mean, if you're in the world of statistics and analyzing trends, if you could fix something to the rate of 17% improvement, why we're not making sure every single high school student from grade probably 6 through 12 gets some flavor of financial aid counseling. Now, that is not sitting down with a 12-year-old or a 5-year-old's parents and talking to them about completing a FAFSA. It's, do they know how to finance? Do they know what a loan means? Do they know what taking that out and paying that off looks like? You know, that was, not to get political, but I love the comment from the the Commerce Secretary a few weeks ago when none of the federal workers were getting paid, and he's like, well, they should just go take out a loan. He's like trying to explain to folks that that's not really how a lot of people function in their day-to-day life, but helping them with that process. ACT and SAT prep obviously had an impact on that. And one-time services were either not effective or very, very minimally effective. So for example, our high schools are really good at hosting a financial aid night. Almost no connection between that and whether or not they enrolled in college or not, which is really funny when you think about it, because having done those programs, the parents who come to those things are the parents who probably don't need to be there the most. And they're coming because they're nice, engaged parents, and it's Iowa, and the Iowa Nice comes out, and they feel like they want to support the school and the program that they're offering, so they show up. So this is a graphic that was taken directly from the publication, but essentially it breaks down this service type. These are those four categories, and then I just give you a couple of examples of what does a college visit look like, that they're shadowing students, that they're participating, so it gives you an idea. But we know that campus visits and financial aid counseling were the biggest, and then getting some support within school, and then getting some actual post-secondary advising were found to be impactful. The things that were not found to be impactful was herding all of the kids into an auditorium to have someone tell them about why they should go to college. And in fact, a lot of our schools have grants that bring people in that they pay a lot of money to. And it was the only measure in our whole study that was actually correlated with decreased college enrollment. Like it was almost like actively turning them off to the idea that they should go. So we were like, maybe they're getting scared away. We really couldn't quite figure it out, but and really there's probably no reason for it, but it was something interesting to look at. So that was one study that we did with high-risk populations through the Gear Up study, and then concurrently at the same work. So the data set that we were finding that we were tracking students for 8 years after they left high school. We took that enrollment data set and their award completion, that's a federal data set, and then we matched it back with their K-12 records. And we tried to figure out, so what were they doing in K-12 that really mattered? And I'm going to show you a handful of things that are really specific to the work of high schools. But some of the things that we found also were things like attendance. I mean, if students did not have a 93% or better attendance rate in high school, they were very unlikely to go on and succeed. And as employers, if your employees were showing up less than 90% of the time, they wouldn't be successful employees for you either. So that was a number that we noticed fairly early. There was some connection back to some other predictive studies that looked at elementary reading and middle school math. And those metrics were also predictive of whether or not they were going to go on and succeed. So we had some other ones in there, but these ones were a little bit more behavioral. These were things, when I say behavioral, they were things that we could observe, measure, and teach kids how to do as skills that we could impact the outcome of that. So one was that, and it says school counselor, but I also know that students oftentimes get post-secondary advising from a variety of sources. And in fact, if you survey students, most of their information about college comes from 3 sources. What do you think they are? First, their friends. Second would be parents. And third would be college admissions types of advisors on that. So, but if they were meeting for the purpose of post-secondary advising with their school counselor in high school, they were more likely to enroll. And some of these are really obvious, but I'm always astounded by the number of schools and other groups who don't track whether or not who's meeting with these kids for post-secondary advising. Like, there should be a spreadsheet somewhere. I met with every single one of my students, not just the rich white ones whose parents can afford to send them to a $60,000 liberal arts school. Every kid. And that means, and for some kids, that means going into a job placement program. And for other kids, it's the military. And for other kids, it's a vocational program. But every kid gets that meeting of what's my post-secondary advising going to look like. And again, college there, you could insert that with, I loosely use the word college to mean everything after high school. But I have to always stop because that's not most people's default. They look at 4-year liberal arts on-campus experience. But did they apply? I mean, it's such a simple thing. But we often don't, we ask kids, did you apply? Yep. Remember I mentioned earlier, like, it's surprising to me as a parent of teenagers now, they don't always do what they told us they did. So getting them to apply and that someone follows through on that. Filing a financial aid and other scholarship applications. I mean, we've heard over and over again the number of students who don't file FAFSA and who don't apply for scholarships. And those of you, I know a couple of you in the office or in the room who are the scholarship granting institution, and you're standing like this with money, and people won't even walk up and take it out because it requires a 1-page application and a 2-paragraph essay. I mean, I've heard kids say, it's only $500. I said, if I could do something for 40 minutes for $500, I'd be doing it all day long. But in their mind, they're just thinking in the grander scheme of this, it's not worth my time, and they don't fill it out. So obviously that they take some sort of exam. That, again, for the military, that's the ASVAB. Community colleges, at least around here, are requiring students to take the ALEX, as are the Regents institutions, and then the standard SAT, ACT. I'm a fan of getting all kids to take some form of one of those assessments, because I've also interviewed a lot of students who have said, like, I just didn't think that I was college material. So they'd never been on a campus, didn't feel like they belonged in the environment. They'd never taken an assessment to let them know that maybe they were qualified to get into one of those programs. So they've gone through their whole K-12 process thinking, my school is preparing me for a step that I'm not going to take, so I'm going to start disengaging. So they start not coming to school in middle school. They start having behavior issues in middle school and high school because they know that high school is preparing them for a life that they're not planning to pursue. And I get fairly critical with and I get in a little bit of trouble with the English departments when I say this. So I say this with a little bit of a asterisk. In all of our high schools, kids read literature, right? Like, how many of you read Shakespeare while you were in high school? I used to say, how many of you had to? Now I say, how many of you got to read Shakespeare in high school? how many of you were asked to read a 10-page installation manual of an air conditioning system and break down the technical writing in that? Probably none of us, right? And we just need to make sure that our programs are serving all kids and not just the 40% who are going to go on and complete a 2 or 4 year. Obviously, attending orientation and getting them to pay and sending their final transcripts. I mean, those were some things that are easy. Those are, I call them, those are the naggy things. Like, there are a lot of things on there that you can nag a kid into, but a lot of students don't realize how helpful they are. So in looking at that, we did our third study, and this one I'm going to go through rather quickly. Our third study looked at what were components associated with post-secondary readiness and success within districts. And one of the things that we found was that if the district leadership and building leadership attend to it, we are seeing increases in whether or not students are taking, I have ACT for the purpose of the slide, but it's ACT, SAT, ASVAB, and ALEX. So students are taking those assessments, they're more likely to go, that their counselors are engaged in exactly what we just went through for the last hour. I mean, look at the increases there. That the staff have that. But one of the things that we found was that districts who have staff who started to understand this, those were the increases in their post-secondary exam rates. And in fact, that number was higher, but I had to pull Muscatine out because Muscatine, the year that we did the study, decided to test all students, which artificially inflated that. So even when I pulled them out, we were still at 40%. And then the last one, that participation in FAFSA completion initiative. And actually, we had so much traction with that statewide. And actually, I think there was a press release that went out, I want to say yesterday. Iowa is now the first state in the country that provides to every single high school a list of every single senior and their current FAFSA status. So we can look up any 12th grader. Every high school gets it weekly, and they know if the student started one, if they finished it, if they submitted it and sent it to a college or university, and if there's an error, what the error is and how to correct it. So every school is now getting that for every one of their seniors. So that actually started as an initiative we did here in Mississippi Bend in our region, and it was so successful that we scaled it up statewide, and we got to 100%, I think, on Monday. So, so coming back to what role you can play in supporting this, there are a number of things that are either available to you now or are partners with Iowa College Aid, and locally that's known as Aligned Impact Muscatine and the local College Access Network. But there are opportunities where a couple of years ago, I think it was 2 years ago now, in Davenport, Iowa College Access Network, now known as ICANN, provided a FAFSA completion training for nonprofit organizations. So we had Big Brothers, Big Sisters, and I don't remember who else was all in the room. Did anybody here attend that? I know that I feel like United Way Quad Cities set that up for the Quad Cities region. But they provide a half-day training and helping people help families. We actually had a lot of tax preparers there because some of the tax preparation companies provide FAFSA completion assistance to families. And certainly some of those events, helping students complete the application process. You'll notice that these are all tied back to some of the bullets on the other screen. If you have programs where you're inviting students and families in, consider having them on campuses. Just the feel of being here and being in this building and knowing what this is college, differently than being in your agency or in your office. Try to find ways to get students and families into these types of environments as often as you can. Most importantly, I think, is that just having this sidebar conversation with the staff that are in your agencies who work directly with students and families, if they know this, they can kind of insert those comments here and there over time. You know, like they're the ones who have a trusting relationship with these families, particularly with some populations who are maybe distrustful of groups who are trying to send the message that they need to go on. They need to know that they've got people that they can trust, who know what they need to know to help them with each of these things. And then the last one on there is about engaging with local employers, because they will be the ones to tell you. That Future Ready Iowa Summit, that was the first one that was held here in Muscatine in September. Is that right? Has it been that long already? Employers said loud and clearly what they needed, and the things that they needed were the things that we're trying to help accomplish. But we just need more people in the community, community partners sending that message, and that it's not just coming from the schools. We looked at that intention one, right, and where the kids were telling the school what they wanted to hear. I'm going to college. without really knowing the meat and the meaning behind it. But if the whole community sets that as an expectation for students and families, and then supports them in achieving that expectation, that's what we'll start seeing some of these metrics, hopefully, and these outcome changes for students. So we're at about the end of our time, but I wanted to make sure that I left opportunity for questions and answers, because I've seen a lot of you writing some things down and taking some screenshots of the slide deck, but I didn't know if you had any specific questions that you wanted to ask of me. Thoughts or feedback that you might have. Please. As a one-off event, right. So if a kid just goes to financial aid night and they don't get the advising and they don't get the support to complete their FAFSA and that kind of stuff, if they just do the one thing. So it's really the one-off events. You know, it's more like this comprehensive idea of how do you kind of wrap all of this around a kid and then support them in getting it all done. And just going to one family evening event that's 60 minutes is going to be in one ear out the other. Yeah. Yes. Future Ready Iowa's website, I believe it's futurereadyoiowa.org. I should know that off the top of my head, but I do not. That Future Ready Iowa is the governor's initiative that 70% of Iowans will need a post-secondary credential by 2025. Their website has a lot of resources on it, like local job boards and connections to local industry. But there are also resources for how do you get into a registered apprenticeship. If I have an 11th grader who wants to go into plumbing and HVAC, for example, like how do I do that? You know, and as one who was in that field for a long time, we know that a lot of our high school counselors don't know how to do that. They know how to get a kid into University of Iowa. They know, they could tell you the steps of that by the back of their hand. I got a kid who wants to be a welder. They typically give them, go to eicc.edu and poke around on their website and we'll see what we can find. And I'm not discrediting them as a group, it's just not training that they've had. You know, it's 2- and 4-year colleges are something that most high school counselors are a lot more comfortable with. Any of those other non-traditional pathways that would be considered non-traditional. Military is a good example of one. Their default is, I'll get the recruiter in here. You know, they don't necessarily know a lot of the ins and outs of what the next steps are. But anyway, Future Ready Iowa's website has some good information, particularly with regards to registered apprenticeships. There's quite a push right now to get more of them in the state of Iowa, and we do have some high schools regionally. I think North Scott's one of the few in the state that has a registered apprenticeship program in their high school. And they invite students from other districts. I don't know who's all there, but I mean, that is a fast growing segment of education, is getting students into career programs younger. Yes. Mm-hmm. You know, from my experience as a counselor, I would say anything that you can do to develop an aspiration, motivation, or hope that they see in their future something beyond a high school diploma, and that it's an expectation. I mean, I know it's cute and adorable, but you walk through schools and the kindergarten class comes in and they start championing them as the class of 2026. That's the year they graduate from high school. So the kids from a very young age are taught that high school is the end of the road. So getting them to change that mindset that that is your launching pad, that is not your completion, that is not your stopping point. And again, getting them on campuses, it'll be like, this is where you go next. And just setting it as a standard expectation in our language. I mean, we would never walk up to an 8th grader and say, hey, you're thinking of going to high school next year? I think you'd be good at high school. You should give it a shot. And we do that to every 11th and 12th grader. I mean, if you've got friends and, you know, your friends come over and they've got a 16-year-old, hey, you thinking about school? I mean, those are appropriate comments to have. But it's like we give them an out, right? And we don't do that with kids who, hey, you're thinking of going to kindergarten? You're 5, like you'd be good at it. I mean, it's just some of that language, but they have to, if they don't see themselves there, if they've never been on a campus, it's foreign to them. You know, I was in my grad program when I first moved to Iowa, and there was a guy sitting next to me, And he had never been further west of Des Moines and had never been outside of Iowa. So his whole frame of reference was basically in and around Iowa City. It's the same thing for kids. I mean, if they don't ever get on campuses, they don't see what this is like. I mean, to walk in here and see this studio for a kid who's into video production, this could be very motivating for them, right? Because most of school is sitting in desks and doing work. And K-12 is trying to change some of that dynamic, but the reality is that kids go to school and they read books and they write papers and things like that. But to walk in and see something like this as an opportunity would motivate them. So, yeah. And their families, for that matter. And a lot of our families don't know what college is like. You know, we have 40% of people have an attainment. So this experience of being not only in this room, but on any college campus is not the norm. It feels like the norm for us because we're all in that category. The families and students we serve, this is not the norm for their background. Any other questions or comments? My contact information is up on the screen, so please feel free to reach out if you've got further questions, if you'd like me to give you more specific information or resources to something that your agency or organization does, please feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, thank you all for coming on this cold, snowy morning.